Have you ever sat down and really thought about whether God has a God complex? It sounds like a joke, but if you look at the way traditional theology sets up the creator of the universe, it's a valid question. If a human being behaved with the exact same level of entitlement, absolute dogmatism, and a demand for total submission that we see in holy texts, we wouldn't call them holy, we would call them narcissistic. To see what this looks like in practice, imagine a human named Bob. Bob builds a miniature toy sandbox in his backyard. He populates it with tiny, automated plastic figures that can think, feel, and experience pain. Then, Bob writes a rulebook for the sandbox. The rules state that every single day the toys must bow down, sing songs about how amazing Bob is, and thank him continuously for building the box. If a toy forgets to praise Bob or questions why Bob built the box in the first place, Bob picks up that toy and throws it into a blazing backyard furnace. If you met Bob, you wouldn't think he was a majestic, loving creator. You'd probably call the police. Or, at the very least, you'd diagnose him with a severe case of a God complex. You'd say that he has an untethered sense of self-worth, an obsession with absolute control, and some deeply troubling psychological pathologies. Yet this sandbox is exactly how classical, orthodox theology often sets up the relationship between God and humanity. Which brings us to a massive, uncomfortable question. Why did an all-powerful, all-knowing God bother to do any of it in the first place? Why did he feel the need to hit the start button on the universe, create mankind, and then demand constant eternal praise under threat of cosmic banishment? If a human did this, we would call it a psychological neurosis. So why does the scale of a being all-powerful suddenly turn a textbook ego trip into divine justice? To answer that, we have to look at the anatomy of the God complex itself, specifically its core traits: a belief in one's absolute infallibility, a demand for unquestioning dogmatism, and an inflated sense of supreme entitlement. When you imagine the traditional portraits of God in Western scripture, these exact clinical red flags pop up everywhere. Take the concept of infallibility. A being with a God complex cannot tolerate being questioned or corrected. In religious narratives, this manifests as a complete refusal to be cross-examined by the creations inside the sandbox. When Job, a character in the Old Testament, dares to ask why his life was systematically ruined despite his innocence, the response he receives from God isn't an explanation or a display of empathy. It is a terrifying celestial pull of rank. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Translated into human terms, that is the ultimate gaslighting deflection. I am infinitely bigger and stronger than you, therefore I am right and your moral objections are entirely invalid. Then look at the mechanics of mandatory praise. We are told that God is a jealous God. We are commanded to build massive, ornate monuments to his glory, spend our weekends singing songs praising his name, and continuously vocalize how great, merciful, and powerful he is. Think about the psychological mechanics of that setup. An omnipotent entity creates fragile carbon-based beings who are entirely dependent on him for survival, and then forces them to continuously stroke his ego. If they fail to do so, or if they decide to direct their awe towards a different entity, they are threatened with eternal, agonizing torture. If a human leader set up an environment like this, we would immediately recognize it as a deeply authoritarian, volatile ego structure. We would see a ruler who requires their authority to be aggressively reinforced at all times because their self-worth demands absolute submission. This creates a glaring logical paradox when applied to a deity. In traditional philosophy, God is defined as a perfect, omnipotent, and completely self-sufficient being. He lacks nothing. He has no emotional voids to fill, no hunger, and no loneliness. But a dogmatic demand for obedience and constant requirement for praise imply the exact opposite. Wanting implies a lack. If you are already 100% complete, you have absolutely zero reasons to act. The moment you decide to create a universe filled with billions of conscious beings just to have them tell you how great you are, you imply that your reality was somehow incomplete without an audience. By filtering the creator through the literal terms of dogmatic theology, the universe stops looking like a beautiful mystery. Instead, it starts looking like a hyper-managed, automated theatre production, a sprawling multi-billion-year mechanism engineered for the sole purpose of validating the infinite self-worth of its director. Ultimately, this leaves us with a deeply unsettling realization about the traditional layout of the sandbox. If the rules of reality demand that an all-powerful being requires constant validation from fragile, short-lived creations under the threat of absolute ruin, then the system itself is built on a foundational insecurity. It means that the ultimate authority in existence operates on the exact same psychological flaws that we are actively trying to fix in ourselves. So the next time you look up at the vast silent night sky, the real existential dread isn't that we're entirely alone in the dark. The real dread is the alternative, that the architect of everything is up there, staring down at his backyard toys, waiting for a thank you that he desperately needs to hear. Anyway, thanks so much for listening to this video. I've had this thought in my head for quite a while and didn't really know how to express it. Let me know in the comments what you thought about this subject matter. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.